Close your eyes for a moment. Think about what a Cold War spy looks like. You're probably imagining a man in a perfectly tailored suit. Dark hair, a glass of martini shaken, never stirred. An Eastern European capital glittering with danger and intrigue. Beautiful people in candlelit restaurants. A chase through cobblestone streets. A microfilm passed between gloved fingers at midnight. The Cold War spy of our imagination is one of the most enduring, glamorous, endlessly thrilling figures in all of popular culture. James Bond, Jason Bourne, the Americans, tinker, tailor, soldier, spy. We have told ourselves this story for 70 years, and it is almost entirely wrong. The real Cold War spy, the actual human being who worked for the CIA, the KGB, MI6, or the BND during those 45 years of geopolitical tension between 1947 and 1991, spent most of their career not in the field. They spent it at a desk, reading reports about wheat production in the Ural Mountains, writing cables about agricultural yield statistics, attending meetings about whether a particular Hungarian economist's public statements meant anything at all. Waiting, filing, waiting some more. The real Cold War spy was, in many respects, a very specialized kind of civil servant, underpaid for the stress involved, overworked in ways that never showed up on their official cover, and profoundly, quietly, persistently bored. Tonight, we're going to explore that boredom. We're going to walk through a working day in the life of a real Cold War intelligence officer. Not the cinematic version, but the actual one. The one who ate bad cafeteria food and worried about whether his cover story was convincing enough to explain why he'd taken so many long lunch breaks near the Soviet embassy. This is a history of waiting rooms, of cold coffee, of the slow, heavy, grinding patience that real intelligence work required. It is, by design, a calming story, because the truth of the Cold War spy stripped of Hollywood is that it was deeply, gloriously, soothingly dull. Let's begin. It is a Monday morning in October 1974. The leaves along the George Washington Parkway are turning yellow and rust orange. The air smells faintly of exhaust and damp leaves. A gray Ford Limited moves steadily through morning traffic, its driver a man in his mid-30s, wearing a brown corduroy blazer and a slightly loosened necktie. His name, for the purposes of his current cover assignment, is Robert Caldwell, Economics Attaché, Department of State. His real name doesn't matter. What matters is what he carries in his briefcase. Not a weapon, not a disguise kit, not a one-time cipher pad, at least not today. He carries 3 unfinished cables he needs to finalize about grain import statistics from a Soviet-aligned Polish trade ministry. He carries a half-eaten granola bar he forgot was in there from Friday. He carries a growing sense of vague dread about a meeting at 10 o'clock that he does not believe will be productive. He parks in the long-term lot and walks toward a building that does not appear on any commercial map. The Central Intelligence Agency's main campus in Langley, Virginia. He badges in. He exchanges a few words with the guard. Weather, traffic, nothing of consequence. He takes the elevator to the 3rd floor, which houses the Europe division of the Directorate of Operations. He sits down at his desk. His desk is gray. Metal. Government issue, circa 1962. On it a telephone, a classified routing slip, a wire inbox already accumulating overnight traffic, a coffee mug he brought from home that reads, mildly ironically, World's Greatest Dad. A photograph of his wife and 2 daughters, taken at Virginia Beach the previous summer. A stapler, 3 ballpoint pens. He opens the overnight traffic. The first cable is from Vienna Station. It is 12 pages long and concerns the activities of a Hungarian cultural attaché whom the station has been watching for 14 months. The attaché went to the opera on Saturday. He ate dinner alone at a restaurant on the Ringstrasse. He made 2 phone calls from a public booth, the contents of which were recorded, but not yet transcribed. Robert will continue to call him. Robert reads all 12 pages. He makes 3 notes in the margin. He sets it aside. The second cable is from Frankfurt. It is 6 pages and concerns the travel movements of a low-level East German official who may or may not have an interest in defecting. The word may appears 11 times in 6 pages. Robert reads it. He makes no notes. He sets it aside. The third item is not a cable. It is an internal memo from the Deputy Chief of Station regarding a budget request for increased surveillance resources on a particular Warsaw Pact diplomatic mission. The memo is 8 pages long and contains 3 charts. Robert reads 6 of the 8 pages before his telephone rings. It is not an exciting phone call. It is his supervisor asking whether he's had a chance to review the Warsaw memo. He has not finished it. They agree to discuss it at the 10 o'clock meeting. The call lasts 4 minutes. Robert pours himself a coffee from the communal pot in the hallway. It was made at 7:15. It is now 8:50. The coffee is not good. He finishes the memo. He goes to his meeting. The meeting lasts 90 minutes. 6 people are present. 3 of them agree on the central recommendation of the Warsaw memo. 2 are uncertain. 1 is opposed but doesn't press the point. They agree to revisit the question in 2 weeks, after additional reporting comes in from the field. Robert returns to his desk at 11:45. There are 4 new cables in his inbox. He reads them. He eats his granola bar. He begins drafting a response to Vienna. This is what a Monday morning looks like when you are a real CIA operations officer during the Cold War. Not a car chase, not a dead drop, not a hushed conversation in a shadowy doorway. A desk, cables, bad coffee, a meeting that could have been an internal memo. The great Cold War intelligence apparatus, the sprawling, multi-billion-dollar machinery of American and Soviet espionage ran on paperwork. Mountains of it, oceans of it. Reports filed in triplicate, routed through classification systems, read by analysts who read other analysts who briefed other analysts who eventually synthesized everything into a 3-page document that a cabinet official might glance at over breakfast. This is the truth they don't put in the movies. Let us leave Robert at his desk for a moment and travel to a different kind of Cold War experience. The surveillance officer. In popular culture, surveillance sounds dynamic. A man with binoculars on a rooftop. A van with darkened windows parked near a target's apartment. The tense moment when the watcher and the watched nearly make eye contact. In reality, surveillance was, above all other things, an exercise in patience. Consider a real account drawn from the training manuals and memoirs of CIA operations officers from the 1970s and 1980s. A surveillance team tasked with monitoring a foreign diplomat suspected of intelligence contact. Let us place him in Washington, D.C., somewhere near Embassy Row on Massachusetts Avenue, would begin their workday, typically before 6 in the morning. They would take their positions, some in vehicles, some on foot, dressed unremarkably postal workers, joggers, tourists with cameras, a woman walking a dog. And then they would wait. They would wait while their target ate breakfast. They would wait while he or she read the newspaper. They would wait through a late start to the working day, through a morning of meetings they couldn't see, through a lunch that turned out to be a perfectly ordinary meal at a Georgetown restaurant with 3 diplomatic colleagues. They would wait through the afternoon, through the slow, dragging hours between 2 and 4, when nothing in the entire city seemed to move with any particular intention. Through the brief burst of activity, around 5 o'clock a walk, perhaps, or a stop at a dry cleaner before the target returned home. At the end of a 12-hour surveillance day, the team would write up their reports. The report, for this hypothetical but entirely realistic example, might read something like subject, departed residence at 842. Proceeded directly to embassy, arriving 901. Remained on site until 1247. Lunched at Clyde's of Georgetown with 3 identified embassy colleagues. Returned to office 1415. Departed at 1738. Visited CVS pharmacy. Purchased items including tissues and what appeared to be aspirin. Returned home 1811. No anomalous contacts observed. No brush pass or dead drop suspected. Day assessed as routine. This report represents 12 hours of human labor. Multiply it by 6 days a week. Multiply it by weeks that can stretch into months. One surveillance subject might be watched for a year, 2 years, 3 years, without ever making contact with a foreign intelligence service. Without ever doing anything, even remotely espionage adjacent. Many subjects were never doing anything at all. They were simply diplomats doing diplomat things, which mostly consisted of attending functions, writing reports, and being mildly homesick. The watchers watched them anyway. Because this is what intelligence work actually is, the elimination of uncertainty, done through the painstaking accumulation of ordinary data. You watch a man long enough that when he finally does something unusual, an unscheduled walk through a park, a phone call from a different booth, a 20-minute delay in returning from lunch, you notice immediately. Because you have watched him not do those things 300 times before. The glamour of espionage is built on a foundation of crushing monotony. You earn the interesting moment only by surviving an almost incomprehensible quantity of uninteresting ones. In the movies, a dead drop is a tense, 2-minute sequence. Thrilling music, close calls. The protagonist sliding something under a park bench while a KGB officer strolls 40 feet away, oblivious. In reality, a dead drop was a bureaucratic ritual so cautious and slow that the tension was almost entirely internal and visible to any outside observer, and almost entirely composed of waiting. Let's walk through what an actual dead drop looked like, based on the accounts of defectors, retired CIA officers, and declassified training materials. A dead drop is a method of exchanging materials documents, microfilm, money, instructions between a handler and an asset without the two ever meeting in person. This was particularly important during the Cold War because any direct meeting between a CIA officer and their Soviet or Eastern Bloc source created enormous risk. It could be surveilled. It could be photographed. It could compromise both parties simultaneously. Instead, a location was selected. A hollow in a particular tree in Rock Creek Park. A specific loose brick in a wall in Vienna. A magnetic container stuck to the underside of a particular park bench in Moscow. A crevice between the third and fourth stones of a particular wall in Berlin. The location was known to both the handler and the asset. The signal that the drop had been loaded, that materials were waiting, was not a phone call or a note. It was something even more mundane. A chalk mark on a mailbox. A thumbtack in a specific telephone pole. A piece of tape on a particular signpost. On a given morning, an intelligence officer might drive past a mailbox on their commute to work and see a chalk mark that was not there yesterday. They would note it. They would say nothing to anyone. They would continue to work. At lunch, but not immediately, not predictably, they might walk past the agreed dead drop location and, in a single fluid motion that took perhaps 2 seconds, retrieve a folded piece of paper or a small package. They would not look at it. Not there. They would continue walking. They would buy a sandwich. They would return to the office. Only later, in a private moment, would they examine what they had retrieved. And what had they retrieved? What secrets were worth all this elaborate, painstaking procedure? Often typewritten sheets about economic policy deliberations. Analysis of a particular Politburo member's recent speeches. A summary of internal debates within a Warsaw-packed military ministry. Structural data about a factory that might be producing components for something more sensitive than it appeared. Important, certainly. Valuable, absolutely. But not, on their face, exciting. Pages of text about institutional decisions. The quiet, dry administrative machinery of a foreign government, patiently gathered by someone who sat in that machinery every day and passed along what they saw. The most famous dead drop in American intelligence history belonged not to a heroic asset, but to a traitor. Robert Hansen, FBI agent and Soviet spy, used dead drops in Northern Virginia parks for 22 years. His most active drop site was a simple wooden footbridge in Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, a quiet suburb, dogs being walked, children on bikes, absolutely nothing about it that would suggest it was a node in a global intelligence network. 22 years. Packages under a bridge. Notes in a pre-agreed format. This is what espionage actually looks like from the outside: a man in a park, stopping briefly near a bridge, continuing his walk. Completely invisible, completely unremarkable. Tedious, methodical, and immensely effective. Perhaps nothing in the Cold War intelligence world better captures the texture of real espionage than the safe house. A safe house was a location, an apartment, a suburban home, occasionally a hotel room held under a cover name where intelligence activities could take place without exposure. Meetings with assets, debriefings of defectors, planning sessions that couldn't be held at the embassy or the official station. The safe houses of the Cold War were not, by and large, glamorous. They were unremarkable apartments in ordinary neighborhoods. A 2-bedroom walk-up in a Vienna suburb with outdated floral wallpaper and a kitchen that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cooking. A suburban house in West Germany with brown carpeting, a yard that was always slightly overgrown, and a broken dishwasher that no one had ever gotten around to fixing because the lease might not be renewed next year.
Anyway,
A retired CIA officer who worked European postings in the late 1970s described safe house work this way in his memoir. You arrive first, always. You check the windows. You check that the pre-agreed signal has been left a particular curtain position, a specific pot plant in a specific window. You sit down. Wait, you have usually brought coffee in a thermos because the instant coffee in the safe house kitchen It's from 1971 and tastes accordingly. And then you wait some more. The waiting in a safe house had a particular quality. It was not comfortable waiting. It was not the relaxed patience of someone reading in a garden. It was a heightened, watchful patience, a waiting that required you to hold a certain amount of alertness in reserve at all times, even while you sat still and did nothing. You were listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. A car that had driven past the same building twice. Voices on the landing outside that paused a beat too long. The telephone that rang twice and stopped the signal, in some arrangements, that the meeting should be aborted. Often, the person you were waiting for didn't come. A meeting might be scheduled, carefully arranged through a series of pre-signals that had themselves taken weeks to set up, and then simply not happen. Your asset had developed cold feet, or their schedule had changed unexpectedly, or they had simply been unable to find a reason to be away from their official duties at the right time. You waited the agreed time. You left. You wrote a cable noting that the meeting had not taken place. You suggested a contingency date. You filed it and went home. And this is the thing about safe house waiting that no film has ever truly captured. It was not dramatic. It was not the tense, sweating, white-knuckled vigil of the thriller genre. It was, after a certain number of years, simply one more kind of quiet room. Another place in which to sit with your own thoughts, to be alone with the low hum of a foreign city outside the window, to feel the particular and curiously private weight of doing work that you could never discuss with anyone who hadn't also done it. Many officers described safe house waiting as oddly meditative. You were present in a way that normal office work didn't require. You were alert, yes, but you were also, in a strange way, at peace. There was nothing to do but wait. And in the intelligence world, that was a kind of permission. Let us talk about agricultural data. This may seem an unlikely topic for a spy history. And yet, and this is a fact that emerges again and again in the memoirs and declassified documents of the Cold War era, an enormous amount of intelligence work during those decades concerned food. Specifically, Soviet food production. Or rather, Soviet food production, as reported by Soviet agricultural ministries, which was not necessarily the same thing as Soviet food production as it actually occurred. The Soviet Union had a profound and persistent gap between official agricultural statistics and agricultural reality. The collective farm system created powerful incentives to over-report yields, under-report shortfalls, and manipulate numbers in ways that presented a more optimistic picture to Moscow than the actual state of the countryside warranted. This meant that accurate intelligence about Soviet grain harvests, about whether the USSR was going to need to purchase food on the international market in any given year, and how much was of genuine strategic importance. It affected global grain prices. It affected the geopolitical leverage of the United States as a major grain exporter. It affected, in the long run, the economic pressures on the Soviet system itself. So CIA analysts read agricultural reports. They read a lot of them. They cross-referenced official Soviet statistics with satellite imagery of collective farms. They looked at railroad freight data to see how much grain was being moved where. They talked to diplomats, trade officials, and traveling businessmen who had been in the Soviet countryside and could describe what they had seen. And then they wrote their own reports about these reports. A former CIA analyst who worked Soviet economic issues throughout the 1970s, once described his daily reading list as TASS agricultural bulletins, Pravda economic supplements, East German trade statistics, Polish industrial output figures, a weekly summary of Hungarian grain prices, and a monthly review of Soviet fertilizer imports, plus any cable traffic from field stations that touched on economic matters, which by the time you included all the peripheral references was quite a lot. He was asked whether this work felt important. "It felt like reading," he said. "You just read and read and read until you understood something you hadn't understood before. And then you wrote a paper about it. And then you sent the paper up the chain. And then you read some more. The paper." He was probably most proud of a 1977 assessment of Soviet grain shortfalls that proved remarkably accurate when the USSR made large international grain purchases. The following year was 14 pages long, based on approximately 3,000 pages of source material gathered over 8 months, and was read, as far as he could determine, by perhaps 12 people. 12 people at the cost of one analyst's full attention for most of a year. This is the economics of intelligence work. The ratio of input to output. The proportion of human attention expended to the quantity of useful information produced. By almost any commercial standard, it is a brutally inefficient process. But this is how you know things. Not through daring and flair, but through volume. Through the patient accumulation of small, unglamorous facts, until the shape of a larger truth becomes visible. Someone had to read all those agricultural reports. For 30 years, a great many people did. There is one element of the Cold War spy's life that truly was unlike anything in civilian experience. Not the danger, which was real but infrequent for most officers. Not the secrecy, which was burdensome but manageable. Not even the loneliness, which was significant but not unique to intelligence work. It was the cover. If you were a CIA case officer serving overseas, you were almost certainly doing so under a cover identity. You were officially something else, a State Department Foreign Service officer, perhaps, or a Treasury Department attaché, or an employee of a private consulting firm with vague government connections. You had a cover story that explained your presence in the country, your access to certain circles, your occasional unusual schedule. And you lived that cover story every day with the people around you. Your colleagues at the embassy who were not CIA, the genuine State Department officers, the USAID workers, the military attachés were not cleared to know what you actually did. To them, you were exactly what your cover said you were. A fairly unremarkable diplomat in a fairly unremarkable posting. Your neighbors in whatever apartment building or diplomatic housing you occupied knew you only by your cover identity. The locals you came to know over years in a posting, the shopkeeper you bought bread from every morning, the colleague's wife with whom your wife had become genuinely friendly, the dry cleaner who recognized you after the first few visits knew only the cover, and your family. This was, for many Cold War intelligence officers, the most quietly painful dimension of the work. Your spouse typically knew the CIA required disclosure before marriage, and the nature of postings made sustained concealment from a live-in partner nearly impossible. But your children, often, did not. A father who worked for the government. A father whose job had never been precisely explained. A father who sometimes took phone calls in another room and emerged looking briefly elsewhere, before returning to dinner as though nothing had happened. The children of CIA officers from this era have written and spoken extensively in the decades since about the strange texture of growing up with a partially known parent. The conversations that stopped when you entered a room, the instilled habit of not discussing family matters outside the house, the vague unease of understanding that there was something significant about your life that you were not supposed to talk about, without being fully sure what that thing was. One former officer, writing in a memoir published long after his retirement, described the experience of cover this way: "You become very good at partial truths. Not lies, exactly, you tell yourself that, but truths with important parts removed. The neighbor asks what you do, and you say government work, foreign affairs, nothing very interesting. And that is true, but the removed part is significant. And over time, you notice that the removed parts accumulate. They accumulate and they form, eventually, a kind of parallel interior life that runs alongside your visible one. You carry it everywhere. You get very good at carrying it. This is the weight that doesn't show up in the films. Not the dramatic burden of a hero in mortal danger, but the quieter, more permanent weight of a person who has structured their entire visible life around something they cannot say." Many officers describe returning to Langley after a long foreign posting with a feeling not of triumph or relief, but of something closer to disorientation. The cover was over, but the habit of partial disclosure was not. It had become, over years, simply how they related to the world. They had to learn, sometimes with considerable effort, how to have conversations in which they said what they actually meant. Everything we have discussed so far has described the American intelligence experience. But the Cold War, almost by definition, was bilateral. And the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the KGB, or Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, Committee for State Security, operated under similar conditions of procedural routine, bureaucratic tedium, and institutional patience. Let us now cross the ideological divide. It is also 1974. It is Moscow. A KGB officer in the First Chief Directorate, the Foreign Intelligence Arm, roughly equivalent to the CIA's Directorate of Operations, is also beginning his Monday morning. His experience, stripped of ideology, bears a striking resemblance to Robert's in Langley. He has a desk. The desk is also gray. It is also metal. The KGB's Yasnevo headquarters, completed in 1972 on the southwestern edge of Moscow in the Yasnevo district, was a sprawling complex of offices that looked, to many of its employees, remarkably similar to any large government bureaucracy anywhere in the world. Corridors, filing cabinets, meeting rooms with too many chairs. He reads overnight traffic. There is cable traffic from the New York Residentiura, the intelligence station operating undercover within the Soviet diplomatic mission at the United Nations. There is a report from the Washington Residentiura about the movements of a senior State Department official. There is a request from the London station for additional funding for a cultivation operation targeting a British defense contractor. He reads all of it. He makes notes. He attends a meeting. The meeting is, if anything, longer than Robert's. The KGB's internal culture was, if anything, more bureaucratically formal than the CIA's, with greater emphasis on written authorization for any significant step and a greater fear of the consequences of unauthorized action. This was not paranoia without foundation. the Soviet system punished unauthorized initiative with a reliability that the American system did not match. An American CIA officer who took an unapproved action and succeeded was likely to be forgiven, perhaps even celebrated. A KGB officer in the same situation might be celebrated, yes, but might also find himself facing a disciplinary board that cared less about the success than about the deviation from protocol. The result was a culture of careful, comprehensive documentation. Every decision recorded, every authorization obtained, every deviation from procedure flagged and justified in writing. More paperwork, more meetings, more waiting for approvals to come down through channels. The KGB officer who served as the handler for the most productive American agents. The Walkers, Ames, Hansen spent far more time writing reports about what their assets had provided than they spent actually meeting with those assets. The handling of Robert Hansen over 22 years, for instance, was primarily a paper operation. He loaded dead drops. Packages were retrieved. The contents were analyzed, evaluated, translated, distributed. Reports were written about the reports. The KGB officer responsible for the Hansen relationship, a senior official in the American Department of the First Chief Directorate, estimated in a later account that for every hour spent on any activity related to the Hansen operation, roughly 40 minutes was pure paperwork. His coffee, too, was not good. The Yasnevo canteen was not celebrated for its cuisine. In this, at least, the Cold War was symmetrical. Cold War intelligence careers were, by their nature, long. The CIA's career development model, particularly for operations officers, was structured around extended overseas tours punctuated by periods at Langley. A typical career might span 25 to 30 years. 3 or 4 major overseas postings, each lasting 2 to 4 years. Periods in between spent in headquarters assignments, managing files, writing assessments, attending training courses, waiting for the next posting. The transitions between postings had their own specific texture of waiting. When you returned from a major field assignment, you were debriefed. This was not a single dramatic session in a secure room with bright lights and urgent questions. It was, characteristically, a process. A series of meetings spread over several weeks. Sessions with your immediate chain of command. Sessions with analysts who wanted to know specific things about specific issues. Sessions with the counterintelligence staff who wanted to ensure that nothing about your time overseas suggested you might have been compromised. The debrief sessions were careful and thorough. They were also, very often, slightly repetitive. The same questions asked in slightly different ways over multiple sessions. The same events recounted from slightly different angles to see if anything new emerged. Between sessions, you waited. You were technically on duty, but effectively in a holding pattern. You attended meetings you weren't essential to. You caught up on cable traffic you had missed during your posting. You read briefing books about the next assignment that hadn't yet been confirmed. Officers in this transitional state described it as oddly suspended. You were back in the United States, back with your family, no longer living under your cover story, and yet the rhythms of the previous posting still ran in you. You still noticed things, cataloged things, maintained the habit of situational awareness that field work required. You still caught yourself composing mental reports about situations that required no report. The transition back to ordinary civilian life, which most officers would eventually need to make at retirement, was, for many, the most disorienting passage of their careers. You had spent 25 or 30 years in an institution that was comprehensively unlike civilian life in its rhythms, its expectations, and its relationship to information. You had spent decades knowing things that most people didn't know, doing work that most people didn't do, moving in a world that most people were entirely unaware of. And then, typically in your mid to late 50s, it ended. There was a retirement ceremony. Quiet. Internal, the CIA did not do large public celebrations of its employees' service. Perhaps a plaque. Perhaps a small gathering of the people you had worked most closely with. A brief speech from a senior officer. And then you left the building. You drove home. You had to decide what to do with the afternoon. Many retired CIA officers described this first afternoon or the first week or the first year with a particular kind of wistful disorientation. The days, which had for so long been structured by work that mattered urgently and secretly, were suddenly entirely open. There was no cable traffic to read, no meetings to attend, no asset to keep track of, no cover to maintain, no report to write by Thursday. Just an ordinary house in Northern Virginia. A spouse. Perhaps grown children who visited on weekends. The silence, after 30 years of the constant, low murmur of institutional purpose, was the thing that took the most getting used to. We have come a long way tonight from James Bond. We have spent our time in the gray offices and quiet apartments of the real Cold War intelligence world. We have read cables and attended meetings and waited in safe houses and noted chalk marks on mailboxes. We have drunk bad coffee and filed reports that 12 people would read and written assessments of wheat harvests that would eventually, in ways too diffuse and indirect to trace precisely, affect the course of world history. What do we make of all this ordinariness? There is something almost meditative in it when you step back far enough. The Cold War, one of the most consequential geopolitical events in human history, a 45-year standoff between nuclear-armed superpowers that shaped the lives of billions of people, was maintained, in significant part, by the daily labor of ordinary people doing very unglamorous things very carefully for very long periods of time. The analysts who read those agricultural reports were not heroes in any conventional sense. They were civil servants with security clearances. They were people who were good at reading and synthesizing and writing, who happened to apply those skills to material of strategic significance. The case officers who ran assets and managed dead drops and waited in safe houses were not the swaggering adventurers of fiction. They were, mostly, patient, disciplined, somewhat solitary people who had a higher tolerance than average for ambiguity and a lower need than average for external validation. They did their work. They filed their reports. They came home wherever home was that posting, and they sat down to dinner, and they talked about their children's schoolwork, and they went to sleep. The world, because of their work, remained slightly more legible to the people in Washington who needed to make decisions about it. Slightly fewer catastrophic miscalculations were made because there were people who had read enough agricultural reports to know that the Soviet leadership was under significant domestic pressure in 1981, and that this should perhaps moderate the assumptions underlying a particular strategic initiative. No one will ever make a film about this. There is no way to make a film about this. It is, by its nature, invisible. It is the absence of catastrophe. It is the disaster that didn't happen, because someone had, quietly and without anyone watching, provided the information that prevented it. The unglamorous is often the necessary. The tedious is often the functional. The man reading agricultural reports in a gray office in Langley, Virginia, in 1974 was, in his own quiet way, standing watch. He just happened to be standing watch over a filing cabinet. And this, perhaps, is the deepest truth about the Cold War spy. They were not remarkable people in the way fiction tells us. They were people who showed up, day after day, and did the work that needed to be done, in the way that almost all essential work is actually done. Quietly, patiently, without applause. Let the images of tonight's story settle now. The gray desk, the stack of cables, the coffee that's gone cold, the walk through the park, the chalk mark on the mailbox, the 2 seconds it takes to retrieve something that took 3 months to produce, the safe house in Vienna, the floral wallpaper, the sound of the city outside, the waiting that is, after all, its own kind of presence, the agricultural reports. Page after page of numbers about a country you will never visit, a countryside you can only imagine, a harvest that may or may not be what it claims to be. The weight of the cover, the partial truths, the parallel interior life, carried so long it has become simply the way you are. And at the end of it all, the quiet house, the open afternoon, the silence after 30 years. There is something almost peaceful in this history, if you let yourself rest inside it. The world was watched over, carefully, patiently, by people who never appeared in the credits. Let that thought accompany you now, as the story fades. You are safe. The watchers are watching. Sleep well.